Thank you for being here today on the Acorn Path. And also thank you for being my first honored guest speaker. So before we get started, I'm just going to introduce Richard Shealey. And you are founder and chief servant of the Optimal Human Global Community, a community of evolved and evolving humans of all ethnicities who are committed to doing their part to end racism as an integral part of the human experience. You also are the creator of Heart Transformed, Ending Racism, a learning system that helps people end their journey with racism, awaken to the fullness of their humanity, and live consciously beyond the constraints of race, racism, and white supremacy. You're also a retired C-suite executive. You were born in 1942, an intuitive empath, and these contrasting experiences have been woven into master problem solver over the years. You also earned a bachelor's degree in commerce and an MBA from DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois, and currently resides in Chicago. You're a father of 2 strong women and 1 male. So, welcome, Richard.
Well, thank you so much. It's exciting, and I'm open to whatever your heart desires for this time.
Yes, thank you. Can we just start really quickly how we got connected? Because we've never actually talked about this story, but I really love how we got connected. So we met in a meditation group, and I actually knew of you from the previous week. I was not there, and a friend of mine who also goes to the meditation group, she said, wow, meditation was so great this week. There was this man named Richard, and he was just sharing some of the most profound stuff. She's like, I think you're going to really love if you get to meet him. So by the time I had already walked into the room the next time you were there and you introduced yourself, I already had this deeply profound, I guess, expectation of like, oh, this person shares profound things. And then I distinctly remember that we had come out of a meditation, and sometimes it's the ritual to kind of share anything that feels noteworthy or maybe for the collective. And I had shared kind of a premonition or thing that I came out with, and you just looked straight at me across the room, and you said, I think it's time for you and I to meet and talk. And then we did, and we went from there and have a lot of really great connections since then. So do you have anything to add to our connection and meeting?
Well, the thing about me that makes me different from lots of people is I'm authentically an intuitive empath. That's the real distinction, because what that does is that it allows me to follow my intuition. That's just one part of it. The other part of it is that I am very sensitive to the energy of other people, and I can become aware of things about that person that they are aware that they're disclosing, because I pick it up energetically. I first learned about this many years ago in the late 70s and the early 80s. I wasn't aware of what it was. It was just something that I knew I could do, but I didn't know what I was doing or how I did it. Or I created a weekend workshop called Success Strategies. And this workshop was created because of young people who were employed by the bank where I was employed, And they were very excited as they came in and bright-eyed and all of the things that, their energy just sparking. And 6 months later, their eyes would be dead and glazed over and empty because the unconscious bias and racism had completely beaten them down in 6 months. And so I wanted, of course, to help them. And I created this 1.5 to 2 day workshop that we did on a Saturday and Sunday to help them figure out how to maintain the integrity of their ethnicity and at the same time how to be successful in an organization saturated with unconscious bias, racism, white supremacy. And these were just, you would have loved these sessions. These were beautiful, beautiful sessions. But what I found was an ability to tap into the aura energy of a person. And I would be discerning things that they didn't know about themselves and putting that, going from the energy to the intelligence of it and putting it into the group for discussion, not only by the person, but also by the remainder of the group. Typically, we would have 15 to 20 young people that we were working with. It was not sophisticated at all. It was very, we gave these people a rough time, but they benefited in the end because in the end, they, our success rate was about 85% in terms of helping people.
When you're saying 85%, how were you gauging that in the program at the time?
It was the written evaluations that the people gave of their experience of the sessions. An example, this is my favorite example from several years. We had a brilliant young woman who was working for a manager who would never look at her when they were having a meeting, and he would never look at her. So this was the solution we gave to her. We said, this is what you do. When you are talking and he's not looking at you, stop talking. And when you stop talking, what he's going to do, he's going to look up. When he looks up, start talking. When he looks away again, stop talking. When he looks up, start talking. And you won't have to have a difficult conversation with him, but you will be teaching him to pay attention to you in a proper way. And she was successful with that strategy. But it was a very empowering strategy for her, which was beautiful.
Yeah.
And another one, we had an older woman. She was probably around 55 years of age. And she was one of those women of color who was a caregiver by nature. So her house was overrun by grandchildren and nieces and nephews and all of this kind of stuff. And so her life was chaos because of all of these people, unruly people in her house. She gained enough strength out of that workshop. She kicked all of them out.
Wow. Now, okay, so can I ask you a question with that? Because some people that are watching this might say, maybe that feels empowering for that person, but especially this relational piece of somebody like kicking people out. Was that able to be done in a way that the connections, the relationships were still intact after that? It wasn't like a cutoff. It wasn't somebody just saying, get out of here. There was work that was done within herself and then also the people that were inhabiting that space around her. Do you know about the intricacies of that?
I don't know about the intricacies of that because what that workshop was really about was empowering the person and not taking into consideration how they might go about their business of being empowered. Uh, we were we were much more interested in empowering the person, and like I said, that was a very rough workshop. You
Yeah.
know, my maternal grandfather taught all of his children and their children that came in contact with him. He taught everybody to be independent and self-reliant, to be a person of integrity and a person of forthrightness. We grew up in an environment of very hard, brutal teasing. You were brutally teased in my family almost from birth. And I didn't understand it until I got to my late teens. And then I understood it was all based on that notion of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And the teasing was all about preparing you for life outside of the family, so that no matter what someone outside of the family attempted to do to you, you had already been through it. And you had a well practiced resilience. You knew how to get through a difficult moment with another person because you had been practicing all your life. So
I mean, yes, we've had sort of these discussions between you and I, but just for people watching this, what always comes up from my perspective when you say that is this idea of just because something might be invalidating or even maybe at times a little traumatizing, you're an intuitive empath and you're getting these criticisms, jokes slung at you from a young age from people that love you and that you love and care about. And so for me, there is kind of that foundational piece of trauma or invalidation and activation in your nervous system. And what comes with that, though, when that is able to be repaired and you can come back to loving, nurturing, caring family, that's not all that's happening in that family system. You have the resiliencies that are then built from
yeah,
that rupture of, wait a minute, this is not what I like. This is not what I'm about. I don't like this negative attention over here. And the repair piece is really what builds resiliency. So I just wanted to break that down of that's always how I make sense of that whenever I hear you talking about that,
yes,
because I'm like, oh my gosh, the young Richard, and just, oh man, that trauma impact of just being such a beautiful, empathic, intuitive soul and doing that, and then you being able to tell this story of resilience of, no, that really prepared me. That really made me stronger and more prepared to deal with the world outside of that. So
yeah,
I wanted to add that piece.
yeah. Well, it's a complicated story as well because what I didn't know at that time, and as a matter of fact, for most of my life, I didn't know about the deep shadow trauma that drove much of my life. I had no conscious awareness of it. If you imagine a child born an intuitive empath, and at 6 months old, the mother drops the child with the grandparents. And for an intuitive child, that would be far more traumatic.
Yeah.
And, and I had that experience.
Yeah.
Although my maternal grandmother, who I was deposited with, was, the most loving person in the world, but she wasn't my mother.
Sure.
And, and that trauma was so severe for me, I learned later in life that basically I had to shut down my energetic ability to feel to avoid the intensity of the pain that went along with that trauma. So that was still there underneath all of that resiliency, but I wasn't in touch with it. I mean, when we were going through earlier, it reminded me I had an uncle. His name was Arthur, and I had not seen him in many years. Probably this was probably the last time he and I were physically together. and and his opening comment was, "Boy, you really looking fat."
Woo!
Had I been a different kind of person, that would have been another one of those micro traumas.
Yeah.
By that time, I understand that kind of family ritual. I understood he was just repeating what had been done to him. So,
Right.
so I let that be all about him and not about me, and resiliently passed it by.
Yeah.
Uh, but that was the kind of thing that would happen.
How did you transcend that? I'm sure there were years and years and years of exploring and doing the work, as we say in the field. But how do you feel that you got to that point where you could see that? You could see that that was that other person's stuff and their learned experiences, so that you didn't have to take that on mentally, emotionally, or energetically.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you precisely when that was. I could only tell you that um, I began to do serious inner work in the late 60s, early 70s. And I was really just fumbling around because there was so much about me that I didn't know.
Yeah.
I didn't know about being an intuitive empath. I didn't know why I was having feelings that I was having. I didn't know why I was drawn to books about energy and consciousness at that time, but I was. And my
And there wasn't the internet, and there wasn't
oh,
YouTube
oh,
videos, and there wasn't TikTok videos, and there wasn't everybody on social media talking about this. This was, you had to back then you had to really, I mean, even up till probably like 10 years ago, you had to really want to seek that out to find that. That wasn't just showing up in front of you.
right. But I had the help of a very strong intuition. I mean, I used to love going into bookstores and exploring bookstores. And I would go into a bookstore and I would go right to the next book in what I needed to know to
Yep.
continue my process of learning about myself. And I always wondered about that, why I was able to do that. But I would go right to the next book that was the next thing in line that would help me out. But early in that process, I learned about non-attachment.
Mm.
And I had a great book about non-attachment. And
Do you remember the name of the book?
I don't remember the name of the book, but the cover was red. that.
Okay.
And it was,
Well, if it was a Buddhist book, many Buddhist books are red, so.
yeah, yeah, well, yeah. And it was because it was a book that was about the Eastern philosophy of
Mhm.
non-attachment. And it helped me to not lend myself emotionally to every trigger, and it impacted me very strongly. But I didn't get it. I really didn't get the idea of non-attachment related to spiritual growth until much later in life.
I made that point to say that you really had to seek those things out and you were guided by your intuition. But yeah, you had to actually go to the bookstore or go to the library and be able to find that there. And I think one of the things that technology has brought us is accessibility. And when you also mentioned that shadow of the trauma and how being unconscious of that. My experience and some of our conversations, and I think this might be a good segue into some of the race and racism work as well, is when we're living from those experiences in an unconscious way. This day and age, let's just talk from present time, might be bombarded with all kinds of different messages and different angles of those messages. One of the things I find really interesting is that there seem to be some common threads. So one of the common threads that I've noticed most recently is this idea of there's mistrust or this understanding or awareness that really is kind of being stirred up in most people of the systems and unconsciously, consciously participating in, and also really just that make our lives run on a daily basis. But there does seem to be across the whole spectrum, regardless of people's outlooks or beliefs or socio-political status, that seems to be one of those threads. And I think a lot back on the work that we did last summer with your program. And so I'm wondering if maybe that's a good segue into you explaining a little bit more of how we can be living from this unconscious, shadowy place and how we do that work.
Well, that is a very complicated arena in which we live, particularly people who live in America, people who live in the United States of America, because there is an hidden challenge within the enculturation process that we all go through. Those of us who are born here or come here and live here for a long period of time. And that is, our society is very much about income inequality. And I have seen very intelligent people write books as if they don't understand what's going on with income inequality. And income inequality is the core hidden value that drives almost everything in this society. Now, most people don't know that the model of income inequality we have, that we've hidden and nurtured all of these years, comes from the experience the English had in Barbados. When Barbados was converted to the most valuable sugar producing island in the Caribbean, to the British nation, it was the Barbadian British who created the plantation economic system. And because Barbados was such a small island, it soon came to a point that the leading plantation owners wanted to own as much of the land as possible, and they began to squeeze out the smaller landowners. And as they did that, those smaller landowners primarily went to the American colonies because at that time, much of the land was just raw land. So the Barbadians brought this system with them. American colonists at that time would have known about what was going on in Barbados anyway because it was the most successful sugar island. And many of the buildings that still stand in London are buildings that were built with the profits from Barbados. We get race. The whole concept of race comes out of this experience because you had these people in the American colonies, Virginia, Maryland, North and South Carolina. You had these, there were 8 families that were given large tracts of land. And part of the charter with the King of England was that they had to make these lands profitable and create a civilization so that the king could get his cut.
Makes sense. I'm a king. I want to make sure I'm getting what I deserve as king.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they were reaching out to people like the small landowner in Barbados who are being squeezed out and saying, if you'll come here and bring your skills and knowledge here, we'll give you some land. The more people you bring, the more land we'll give you. All of this went on, but they also brought with them this plantation economic system. Now, at a given point, somewhere in the middle of the 17th century, the elite planters began to have an economic problem. At that time, they were hiring Africans as workers under contract, I'll say, along with Europeans. And the workers, both African and European, the conditions were so harsh, they were dying before the landowners were able to recover their investment and cover the loans that they had made to buy these contracts. And they were dying too soon. So they needed to answer that question. How do we have workers continuously and we won't lose our crops because people are dying? And we won't lose our crops because an indenture contract ends. So the answer they came up with was, oh, these African people, they seem to be natural farmers. They were farmers before they were kidnapped and brought over here. There's something special there. So what we need to do, we need to figure out how we can have these people as workers for life. And they came up with a scheme of race. And they came up with that scheme because they had to come up with a solution that included a way to enslave people for life. They thought of themselves as devout Christians. And Christian tradition said that you couldn't enslave a person for more than 7 years. At the end of 7 years, if they were a Christian, you had to release them from their condition. So they had to have a solution where Africans could not be eligible to be brought into the church. So they had to make them less than human, had to make them unworthy of being able to live with Europeans. And the way they decided to do that was to create the concept of different races. They aren't the same race. They aren't the same kind of people that we are.
Right.
And they came up with
a hierarchy.
Yes, hierarchy of difference, because Africans weren't considered to be human. They were considered to be beast-like. They were considered to be unintelligent, and you were unable to make them be intelligent. They were, along with indigenous people, they were considered to be hereditary heathens. And that's where race came from. A lot of academics and social scientists and others talk about race created by social forces. And that came later. Before race was a social construct, it was a solution to an economic problem. And that's just a part of the way in which one reads history.
Sure.
And if you are steeped in the imperatives of the status quo, you will read history in the way in which you are intended to read history, in a way the writers would write it. I mean, when I learned about this, it was so interesting to me, where you had a historian who meant well, whose intentions were good, but they would start off a sentence or a passage telling you why race had no place in science, but by the time they got to the end of the passage or the end of the sentence, they were affirming race as it had been historically presented. I thought that was really crazy, but it's part of the process.
Yeah. What's interesting to me is going back to that idea that I was getting at earlier in a segue into this. These unconscious processes that we're living in today.
Yes.
Thank you for walking through that historical. Every time I hear you speak about that, I feel like I'm seeing it from a whole new perspective. And that's quite possibly what's happening. You know, you hear something each time you take something new away from it. And I'm just sitting here realizing that as somebody who was in the day and age and socio-political place where I was raised and where I was in school, history was not my favorite subject. Yes. And I think I mentioned this in the work that we did. And I think there was a piece of that because of the place that we're in, where these textbooks are being written. And well-intentioned or not, we're just at this place where this is just how the story has been told over and over and over and over. And how in depth that goes for us. Yes. So I'm in 5th grade sitting here opened in my classroom where I'm taught to be well behaved and listen to the teacher because the teacher is the expert and the teacher's going off the lesson plan that has been set forth for them. And that's all part of what's coming out of this textbook, who has been written by centuries and centuries of people who have passed down this watered down or distorted version of history. And now we have this information that's much more easily accessible to us, and awakening within us is this mistrust or this, inkling even for certain people of something doesn't feel right here.
Yes.
Without the tools or the resources or the resiliencies to understand that intuitively, or to have the tools to discern of why am I experiencing this feeling from this unconscious place that's very deeply ingrained. And as you said, the complexities of this we probably will not get to. But when I'm hearing you talk about this history, it's really making me realize that we know something inside of us knows that this is not authentic.
Yes.
This is not the authentic, real, truth with a capital T. And I go back to me being that girl in 5th grade with that book open and just hating every minute of history lessons. To the point where I just thought it was because it was dull and boring And when I started really becoming more aware of why I didn't like history, in that, also being an empathic, intuitive person, anything that's not authentic, anything that is rubbing up against that unconscious process of, something doesn't sit right here, and not having the tools or the awareness to be able to know what that means, or how to deal with that. And then you go to, I don't know, your parents, your friends, your whatever, who are also indoctrined in this system, and you get different messaging about that. And I think even it wasn't maybe until our work last summer where we were going through your program and I realized, oh my gosh, I really hated history, because I knew some level of me knew I was being lied to, that this wasn't actually how all of this went. And since then, I really have loved the idea of even knowing how humanity has evolved. Yeah, so I just wanted to add that perspective of like what was coming through for me as well, and my own growth and understanding that feeling that a lot of people are getting, that feeling is the authentic feeling, that knowing something doesn't sit right. And to me, it just feels like, somebody can get really lost really quickly in that. I have this feeling, it's unsettling, I don't know what to do with that, and so I'm going to look outside myself. Yeah. And the first news story that pops up that makes that feeling subside or go away back into our unconscious, or fixes the so-called problem that's sitting in front of me with this feeling, is the solution, or the thing I grasp onto, that attachment piece that you were mentioning you did work with in your own life stream. And then I had become attached to this idea or this ideology of that must be what's happening. And so I'm going to align that with what I believe to be true.
Yes. What resonates with me of what you said is the idea of authenticity, because at our best, we are authentic beings, because what we are made of, the energy that we are made of, is the same energy that constitutes what we call the universe. The truth of reality, whatever that is us. And when we are, as we become more sensitive to that truth, that drives our experience of authenticity. And when inputs come up that generate the tension between the quality of the incident and the lack of authenticity that is within that incident, that generates a visceral feedback from us if we are sensitive enough to take note of it. And that's what's going on. So as we grow spiritually, there is a demand that is made by our whole being. There's a demand that is made for us to be authentic with ourselves, for us to be authentic with all others, all life, and for us to be authentic with the universe. All of those things are happening to us from a quantum perspective. Now, if you know it's happening, then then you can progressively respond in a way that benefits you.